Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the University of Maryland Prevention Research Center's webinar series. Just so you know up front, we record these webinar series to allow for the dissemination of the content of the talk and sort of spread the science about LGBTQ health. And so just have that in mind. And if you are going to, chat and engage in the question and answer that, like these sessions are, or this is recorded. Additionally, as throughout the talk, we ask that you please use the question and answer feature within the Zoom webinar platform. At the end of the talk, we will have the opportunity to have a brief Q&A about the various topics. And we welcome your input and look forward to engaging you in that conversation. Additionally, closed captioning is or will be available. Sorry. I'll make sure that closed captioning is available through Zoom's automatic live captioning feature once we get started. I apologize for forgetting to make sure to turn that on before I started speaking, but I will in a moment. So today we have Dr. Elizabeth Olson, who's an assistant professor in the Human Development and Family Studies program at Bowling Green State University in Ohio. Primarily teaches courses in family diversity and human sexuality, as well as sexual and gender minority populations. Her research also focuses on LGBTQ community experiences with a focus on empowerment of and advocacy for marginalized groups in institutional settings. She earned her PhD in HDFS and a master's in social work from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So welcome, Dr. Olson. I will go ahead and turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thank you for that introduction. I want to give a little bit more information about sort of my background and my own trainings to sort of let folks know where I'm coming from and my frame of reference before I start talking about my research and sort of the workshops that I've led with older LGBTQ folks. So when I did my undergraduate work, I started as a major in psychology because what I was really focused on was individual health and well-being. I wanted to be able to support individuals' overall mental health. And I took a couple of sociology classes, and along the way, I realized how important understanding sort of the community and the social environment around that individual was in thinking about supporting them in their individual health. So I added a sociology major. And then when I went on to get my master's in social work, because I wanted to become a licensed social worker, I wanted to be in the field, doing the work, supporting individuals and couples and families in their overall health and well-being, I knew how important it was to have that additional training on community environments, that I was situating individual within their family, within their community, within their society, and thinking about the connection between environmental factors and individual health and well-being. So when I went on to get my PhD, because I got sucked into the field of research and interested in that, and I did my PhD in human development and family science, it really was sort of bringing and encapsulating that framework that I had been building for myself along the way of thinking about working with individuals and understanding individual and family health and well-being within the context of the environment and the way that society can support or hinder the individual's health and well-being. For a verbal description of the image on the screen, that is me on the left in a blue robe with blue crushed velvet stripes on my sleeve. That is actually the ceremony where I was hooded at my PhD graduation by my academic advisor, Dr. Ramona Oswald, who is standing to the right of me, behind me in that photo. And one of the things that I always appreciated about Ramona is that she always encouraged me to center my passion for social work and for working with individuals and families directly. So in all of my sort of scholarly and academic research that I did, she always, without fail, would ask me, so what? So what do we do with that information? So what does that actually mean for real people's day-to-day lives? How can we actually use this research and use those findings to create better, healthier, more supportive places in the world for people to live? which is why I was so excited when I saw a grant opportunity that was offered through the Optimal Aging Institute at my current institution, Bowling Green State University in Ohio. The Optimal Aging Institute is a research center on campus that is focused on community activism and outreach. So the mission is to support, educate, and engage older adults and those who interact with them through campus and community partnerships with a focus on research and creative activities across the 8 dimensions of wellness. And when they're talking about these different dimensions of wellness, generally speaking, they're talking about supporting and encouraging optimal aging, intending to maximize health behaviors and productive social activities of older individuals. Those at the Optimal Aging Institute believe also that successful aging is dependent on a responsive and supportive environment, that life course conditions and the context that we live in have the potential to help or hinder an individual's aging process, meaning we have the ability to create built environments that support individuals' healthy aging, that encourages individual health and well-being across the entirety of their lifespan. So for me, working with and researching the experiences of LGBTQ plus populations, I was really excited to pursue this opportunity to create more supportive living environments, particularly for older LGBTQ populations that are housed in senior living facilities. And that's actually a pretty large population. It's larger than many people may think. Studies have shown anywhere between 1.5 and 2 million Americans over the age of 60 identify as LGBTQ. So it is a significant population whose needs need to be addressed. There's evidence to show that by 2030, that number could be over 5 million adults who identify as part of the LGBTQ plus community. And these numbers are even larger if we consider parents and grandparents of LGBTQ individuals who also need support for their families as well. So it really is vital to be paying attention to the experiences of older LGBT adults. There's research that shows that LGBTQ older adults face unique challenges to optimal aging. Research studies that compared heterosexual and cisgender older populations to the aging LGBTQ community found that gender and sexual minority older adults disproportionately experience poorer both physical and mental health outcomes. Some risk factors that might jeopardize the healthy aging process for this population could include experiences with discrimination and victimization, that they delay seeking formal care out of a fear or expectation of stigma, societal and family isolation, as well as some other additional stress related to sexual orientation and gender identity that I'll talk a little bit more about later. But these risks actually increase for LGBT older adults who don't find support and acceptance in retirement homes, nursing homes, and senior living facilities. Housing disparities in and of themselves truly can have profound effects on the aging experience for LGBTQ elders. And challenges exist when attempting to access mainstream housing services based on either perceived or very real discrimination. There was one study that was conducted by the Michigan Fair Housing Center, and they found that 26% of senior living facilities in the state either quoted a higher monthly rent or they outright denied a housing application to same-sex couples. There's other studies that show staff at senior living facilities hold more negative views about same-sex sexual intimacy between residents compared to different sex contact, and that service providers actually acknowledge a lack of training and understanding that are specific to the needs of older LGBTQ adults. And so this is a real problem that LGBTQ adults are facing additional risk factors, and the supports and services that they're seeking aren't prepared to meet those needs and address those concerns. Sorry about that. So this gap sort of between needing to address these concerns and not having the training or the understanding among staff was leaving a lot of older LGBTQ adults in a lot of senior living facilities less than sort of fully supportive and fully welcoming of this population. So the goal of our project was to implement a face-to-face training with all of the staff in our community partner facilities in our community, and then assess the effects that those kinds of trainings can have on staff support. So we offered 3 4-hour on-site face-to-face training sessions at our community partner facility back in 2018. So pre-pandemic, when we could do face-to-face trainings in senior living facilities. All of the trainings were consistent. We used the same facilitators, the same room, we followed the same procedures. The only sort of procedural difference between the trainings was that we offered one in the morning, one in the evening, and then one on the weekend. Obviously, it was an active facility. We couldn't pull everybody off the floor at the same time. So in order to catch everyone from every shift, we offered them at different times. We collaborated with the facilities directors. They helped market the training. They helped sign up staff to the different sessions. The administration made the attendance of the training mandatory. Participation in the research collection, the data that was collected for the research portion was voluntary, but the staff were required to go to the training, and it was a paid training, so they could clock in when they attended. Across the 3 sessions, we actually were able to train 85% of the staff at the facility. So that included nursing care, activity support, kitchen staff, housekeeping, secretarial and administrative departments. So we really were able to capture everyone. So the training itself was designed to be very interactive. We used evidence-based best practices in teaching the material. So there was a lot of active learning strategies to try and keep people moving and thinking in different ways and keep them engaged for 4 hours. Specifically, we covered terminology. So we talked about words and symbols that are associated with the LGBTQ community, as well as the impact that language can have on people. We talked about LGBTQ history and the effects of these various events and changes in policies can have on LGBTQ people's lives. And then we talked about those various minority-related stressors that LGBTQ older adults might face. And then sort of wrapped up by providing a lot of concrete best practice recommendations for everyone based on their job descriptions and the interaction that they have with residents and visitors to try and think about what they might do to create support in their organization. So I want to share a little bit more information about each of these pieces of the trainings with you all today, and basically provide a condensed version of the workshop. Unfortunately, we won't be as interactive as the face-to-face training, given that we only have 1 hour, not 4. We're on Zoom rather than face-to-face and in the same room. But I will also try to briefly describe the activities that we did in the face-to-face training. So if you are interested in running a similar workshop in your facility or an organization in your community, I can give you an idea of what that activity might actually look like. So the first topic that we discussed was language and the different terms that are related to the LGBTQ plus community. And we started with the topic of language because it is such a powerful component to social interactions and working with and supporting others. There's this great video on YouTube that I don't have time to show you today, but I encourage you to look it up and watch it in its entirety. But Mayim Bialik, who is a neuroscientist and an actress, she was guest host on Jeopardy for a while. She was Sheldon's girlfriend on Big Bang Theory. And she was also Blossom. So depending on your age cohort, you might remember her from one of those places. But in the video, Mayim talks about the power of language. She says, it matters what we call people. Language matters. Words have meaning, and the way we use words changes the way we frame things in our mind. So it's really important to understand the terms associated with people's identities and respect the labels that they have for themselves. Being in a professional role means showing respect to your clients and acknowledging someone's identity and who they are as a person and how they see themselves is a great way to show that respect. It promotes healthy development and well-being across the lifespan. There is research to show that even the use of transgender adolescents' chosen names and the correct use of pronouns by people in their lives is associated with fewer suicidal ideations and suicide attempts. Language has that much power. So when we're talking about gender identity and sexual orientation in particular, it's really important that you understand the terminology that people use and the meanings behind them. Historically speaking, there are a lot of slang terms and derogatory language that has been used against the LGBTQ community. And there's a lot of hate and violence behind that language. So when you're working with older adults, know that those terms carry that historical weight of violence, even if they're seen as more acceptable today. One example I can give you is the word queer. We talk about the queer community, especially in academic and research circles. We talk about queer identities and queering families and a lot. Younger populations are actually more likely to use terms like queer to describe their own sexual orientation. For older LGBTQ adults, that term might be very hurtful and very harmful, in that they have sort of the historical memories of that term being used in a very discriminatory and derogatory way. Conversely, I have heard older LGBTQ folks use and embrace terms that many younger folks in the LGBTQ community now find outdated and harmful. So for example, the term homosexual, there's been sort of a shift away from using the term homosexual to separate themselves from the history of harm, specifically within the medical community, of how homosexual identity was considered sociopathic among medical professionals in the past. And so there's been a shift away from using that term. However, a lot of older LGBTQ adults came into their identity and embraced their identity when the term homosexual was of its most popular. And so they may describe themselves as homosexual and use the term homosexual to label their identity. And even though other people may find that harmful or problematic today, again, embracing and supporting that older individual within their identities and what it means to them is also really important. So even if it's not your intent, just being very careful and cautious about the words that you use and how you're using them and what that can mean to different people, because using incorrect terms, like I said, can carry that weight of hate and violence for LGBT elders, and cause a lot of undue stress, which I know you would want to avoid if you're working with your clients and wanting to support your clients within your facilities. So in our face-to-face training, we made no assumptions that people had the same understanding of terms and identities that are often used when we're talking about the LGBTQ community. So we started off by talking about the very broad categories of identities. We provided large whiteboards that had this sort of classic genderbread character printed on it. And we handed out dry erase markers, and people could then write and draw directly onto their figures, onto the character that was printed on the whiteboard. And we told them that, before we can even get into the list of different terms that people might use to describe their identities, we have to first figure out and clarify what we mean by sex, gender identity, and sexuality, because a lot of folks were using those terms interchangeably, and we needed to clarify what that distinction was. So biological sex is often rooted in physiological development. So chromosomal makeup, hormone levels, the physical development of internal reproductive organs and external genitalia, all of those sort of biological characteristics go into determining sex that is assigned at birth, right? Gender identity is different from that. Gender is socially constructed rather than biologically determined, right? So gender, rather than being connected to those biological, those physiological characteristics, are sort of characteristics, traits, behaviors, social attitudes that we as a society have collectively associated with different sexes. That's when we think of traditional gender roles and expectations, right? And so gender identity is really thinking about how a person feels internally about those different social categories, and what society says is masculine or feminine, and how I align with those definitions and where I fit or don't fit into this system of understanding gender and social gender norms, right? So that's gender identity. Gender expression is how I choose to present that to others, perhaps by the clothes I choose to wear, how I cut my hair, whether I wear makeup or not, paint my nails, my name, the pronouns I use. All of those things are thinking about how I present or express my gender to others. And then finally, sexual orientation describes, who we are attracted to, either sexually, emotionally, romantically, and it's often based on my own gender identity and the gender or genders of people that I am interested in or attracted to. But it's more about that relational aspect rather than individual. Okay. So after we clarified those sort of broad terms, we went on to define different identity labels that people may use to describe their sex, gender, or sexual orientation. Again, we started at the very basics, just defining lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. We discussed agender, non-binary, queer, pansexual, intersex. We defined what it means to be an ally, what microaggressions look like. What does it mean when people use the terms homophobia, transphobia, heterosexism? Again, I don't have time to necessarily go through all of those terms and definitions with you today, but there are tons of great resources online. A quick Google search will help you find even more nuanced terms and language that people use within the LGBTQ community. But I do think it's important, as I said earlier, to think about terms and language that has been used to harm this community, right? Even things that may seem innocuous to some people, phrases like, that's so gay, or what are you really, what's your real name? Those phrases can significantly harm the relationship that you want to have with clients. And it can undermine their feelings of safety and belonging in your organization. It can bring up past hurts and harms and traumas. So again, just being very cognizant of the language that you use, paying attention to the impact of the language that it can have on the individuals that you're working with, more so than your intent. So the second part of the training then moved into talking about placing the residents into the context of their birth cohorts and understanding how our reactions to different terms or understanding of different topics, our experiences in the world, are all influenced by our age cohorts. So thinking about the socio-political environment, how it's changed across time, right? We are all products of our environments. And as those environments change, they have different impacts on people of different ages. So when we think about working with older adults in particular, it's important to place those folks in the full context of their life history. And when we look at the research on different birth cohorts within the LGBTQ community, we actually start to see some of those differences. This is just one example of that. So the chart on the screen shows some research that was conducted by the University of Maryland's very own Jessica Fish, along with Meg Bishop and others. And they looked at a sample of nearly 1,500 participants between the ages of 18 and 60 who identified as sexual minorities. And they broke them up into 3 distinct birth cohorts. And what you can see is that people in these different age cohorts reported hitting what are seen as sexual identity development milestones at very different ages. So they looked at first same-sex attraction, first self-realization of a sexual minority identity, first same-sex sexual behavior, and then first disclosure to a friend and first disclosure to a family member. And what they found out is that participants from more recent cohorts, so the younger generations, reported earlier and accelerated pacing of these milestones relative to older adults in the society. And I think that is very much reflective to or connected to how those socio-historical environments around them have shifted so much. When the older generation was 18, society looked very different than when the younger generation is now 18, right? So we really have to think about not just sort of today's social environment, laws, policies, social attitudes around LGBTQ plus issues, the level of support and hostility in the community, things like that. But we have to consider how those have changed across a person's lifespan to shape how they think about these identities today, and the experiences that they may have gone through throughout their lives. So let me show you what we did to sort of talk about that history. In the training, we did another activity to try and get folks up and moving around a little bit and really help visualize what the life of an older LGBTQ person might look like. So what we did is we actually strung a laundry line across the length of the full room, and we gave everyone a laminated card that described one historical event related to the LGBTQ community broadly. And folks had to work together. They clipped their events across the line in chronological order. So we created in the end a physical timeline across the length of the entire room to look at all of these experiences. So some examples of events that we talked about were when homosexuality was included as a sociopathic personality disturbance in the DSM as a diagnosis. We talked about when that was removed in 1973. We talked about the Stonewall riots being seen as sort of kicking off the gay rights activism and the civil rights movement. We talked about Don't Ask, Don't Tell as a military policy going into place and what that meant for society and workplaces generally. We talked about how Ellen DeGeneres publicly came out in 1997. She was one of the first mainstream syndicated television show that represented that. We talked about, when same-sex sexual conduct was finally decriminalized in all jurisdictions across the United States, how marriage equality was passed in 2015 at the federal level, and how, workplace discrimination was interpreted to include gender identity and sexual orientation as of 2019. And when we ran this activity in the face-to-face workshop, there were folks who were really surprised at how recently some of these events occurred. And when you think about working with older adults, I mean, a 90-year-old person today was born in 1932. So all of these events have happened in their adult lifetime and in their memory. And so when we're working with the elderly population, again, we have to think not only about today's society and the current social environment, but we have to think about everything that they've gone through and see this entire time span that goes across the room as their entire adult experiences, right? So it's really important to put their life and their development in context, because being able to support them today in your facility, in your organization, means recognizing them as an individual, recognizing their identities, and also acknowledging what they lived through and the things that they've seen, the attitudes that have shifted or maybe not shifted as much across their entire life. And then finally, we talked about minority identity related stressors for the LGBTQ population and what that might look like for older adults. So LGBT people often experience what is known as minority stress, which means that above and beyond typical stresses that most people face in their daily lives, people who identify as part of the LGBTQ community experience certain stressors that are unique to that population. So for LGBT older adults, not only are they facing maybe the stress of moving out of their home and independent living situations, maybe the stress of their own health or family relationships, the loss of friends, they might also, on top of that, be experiencing some of these additional minority-related stressors. So the first one that is classified would be negative experiences related to their gender identity or their sexual orientation. LGBT people have and continue to be called derogatory names, threatened with violence, and even victims of violent attacks. In one study, 82% of LGBT older adult participants report having been directly victimized at least once in their life. More than half of LGBT older adults have been discriminated against in employment or housing. Surveys show that older LGBT adults wouldn't be welcome in 46% of the local senior centers that they, if their sexual orientation or gender identity were known in their senior center, right? These acts of discrimination, these negative experiences are occurring still. The second kind of stress would be anticipation or expectations of negative experiences. So even if hateful things aren't being said or done to them directly, it can be very stressful to go through life just waiting for that to happen. Maybe because it's happened to them before or they've seen it happen to others. But the anticipation might be, if this person or if this organization knows about my LGBTQ identity, the response could be negative. And this alone is causing LGBT older adults not to seek out services and supports that they might need. LGBT people are only 20% as likely as their heterosexual counterparts to access services like senior centers or meal programs. So they are concerned of those negative experiences happening, and they're not getting the supports that they need because of that. The third LGBT-related stress that's been identified is associated with concealing their minority identity. So if somebody doesn't feel safe or they have that fear or that anticipation of negative responses, they might become really hypervigilant to make sure that it doesn't become known. That in and of itself can be super stressful for folks. It means keeping people at bay, monitoring anything that is said about you or anything that you say to others about yourself. It means not sharing an important part of yourself or an important relationship in your life with anyone. And that can be really stressful and really lonely for a lot of folks. And then related to that is the stress or the fear of being outed as LGBT without their permission. And again, this is a really legitimate fear. 23% of LGBT older adults in one study actually reported being threatened with disclosure of their sexual orientation or gender identity to others. And so all of these things together are causing a lot of stress for older LGBTQ adults, which again is diminishing their chance for healthy and optimal aging. So to help folks in our training understand more what this might feel like, we asked them to participate in an activity, what we called the stress of concealment. So we gave everyone a Post-it note, and on the back side of the Post-it note, the sticky side, we asked them to write down something that they would prefer other people not know about them. So whether that was an embarrassing incident that occurred or something that you feel shameful about, you watched every season of the Kardashians ad nauseum, like whatever it is, you write it down on the backside of the sticky note and place it on your shirt so that it's not visible to the outside. And then we just ask folks to mingle around the room for a bit and have a conversation, like a mundane conversation with other people. And many folks felt so much stress in those 5 minutes. They said that they had a really hard time listening to what other people were talking about. They weren't even paying attention to what they were saying to them. They just kept looking down on their chest and making sure that their sticky note was stuck to them and it wasn't revealing their secret or anything like that. And so a lot of folks said that it was a really helpful activity to think about what the experience might feel like for some LGBTQ older adults who don't feel comfortable sharing that identity, who may perceive that the environment is not safe for them to share that identity in. And so I think it really underscored, one, not only sort of the stressors that these folks might be facing and how that can impact their health, but two, the importance of taking on the responsibility themselves to create those supportive environments so that folks weren't feeling those kind of stresses. So once we sort of covered all of that material, we have language to talk about this population. We understood some of the stressors that they may face and have faced across the changing context across their entire lives. we provided some best practice recommendations. What can you actually do as a service provider in your organization, in your professional role, to support those folks so that they're not feeling those stressors, so that they do feel welcomed and appreciated? So the first thing that we recommended was to definitely assume that some folks at your facility, in your organization, identify as LGBTQ or have LGBTQ family members. You have to acknowledge that to be able to then take steps to work with and support those individuals in their identities. As we've talked about, LGBTQ people have unique concerns and stressors that can't be addressed if we're just treating everyone the same, right? So you can make small changes in your professional work that will have big impacts on the lives of your residents. So create visible markers of support. Many people within the LGBTQ community are looking for indicators of a welcome and affirming environment, right? And if people are making that assessment and that support is not clearly visible and apparent, the assumption is going to be made that that support is not there, right? So being very conscientious about the built environment and what markers of support are there. Do you have a rainbow flag somewhere on site? Who is promoted in flyers, brochures on the website? How do you talk about family? How is family represented in images and descriptions of your organization? Those are things that people are looking for that will indicate that they are welcomed or not in their identities. Along with that, I think avoiding assumptions and language is a really important part. So asking about partners and spouses, people who are important to you in your life, those kinds of things invite seniors to share aspects of themselves and their families that may not come up if you're making assumptions about, do you have a wife? Do you have a husband? Making assumptions about people's gender and things like that. If they do disclose identities or relationships to you, ask permission to share that with others. They may not necessarily want peers or other residents in the facility to know that information, and they don't want to have to fear being outed. Giving them space to make decisions on their own when and who to share that with or how it gets shared can be really empowering. They may not even want extended family members to know. And again, that's okay, but respecting and understanding where those boundaries are for that individual. And then finally, I think it can go a long way to assure them that they are safe and welcome and celebrated in your facility. And having things like a non-discrimination policy in the organization and that it is enforced can really help with that. I think it's important to recognize that you as the organization, as the staff, are the ones that set the tone for respect. So send the message early and often that discriminatory behavior is unacceptable. You know, senior peer bullying may happen, but if it does, intervene when you see that, right? Ignoring that, you know, oh, it was just a comment made by another peer and they're old and they say things like that. You know, it sends the message that that's okay and that's acceptable behavior in your facility. And so think about what it means for staff to sort of step in and stop that when it happens, create a climate where it is fully known that discrimination is not going to be allowed, and that the non-discrimination policy will be followed through with if an event happens. So that's what was discussed in our training program. You know, as I said, with a little bit more time for discussions, asking questions, doing more interactive hands-on activities. I know I'm running short on time, so I will just say we also did collect data when we did the face-to-face facility, both before folks participated in the workshop and after, because we wanted to see, you know, what kind of effect could this training actually have on folks. And what the data showed was that there is evidence to show that people's knowledge and understanding increased, that they felt more competent about this population, which hopefully will prepare them to work better with this population and support them more fully and openly. So I want to make sure I save time for questions and answers. So I think I'll wrap up there. I just wanted to say thank you so much to the Prevention Research Center for inviting me to share some of this work with you all today. I want to again thank the Optimal Aging Institute for funding this project and my colleague that I worked with on this project, Dr. Laura Landry-Meyer. I will say that, I know we have some time for Q&A, but if anyone is interested in talking with me directly more about anything related to this project, please email me. My address is eholman@bgsu.edu. I also wanted to let folks know that we do have a detailed training manual available. Looks like this. So if anyone is wanting to run the full workshop within their organization, we can actually provide that instruction manual. So again, folks can just email me for that if they want to know more and see that specifically.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing your incredible work with us today and for that really thoughtful and engaging presentation. As a reminder to the attendees, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of, or it's at the bottom for me. I don't know if it looks different on different platforms, but the Q&A feature within Zoom, and we will work to get through as many of them as we can in the time that we have remaining today. So if it's all right with you, Dr. Olson, I'm going to go ahead and get started with the first question. So one attendee was curious about whether there was any resistance to the training, and also how frequently do you suggest maybe following up on LGBTQ topics and issues after the training? Like what happens after you engage with this training with an organization?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I will say we started in our local community, which is a small university town surrounded by cornfields. It is not a large metropolitan area, although there are a significant amount of senior living facilities in the community and in surrounding communities. And I think we approached, I want to say 6 before we found a community partner that was interested in working with us. And again, this was pitched as a free training that we would provide, that we were working with. And most of the folks on their staff, at least the ones who are credentialed, often have to have continuing education units. And so we were willing to work to get those as certified education units so people could use it for their credentialing. And we had 4 or 5 facilities that were not interested in specifically talking about LGBTQ issues. So there was certainly some resistance to training. The facilities that we did work with were incredible. And I will say the research that we did with the pre-post test, it showed an increase in content, knowledge, and awareness of issues. We did not see a significant change in support and attitudes towards the LGBTQ community. And I think that's because pre-test, the folks that we were working with already scored very high on support in those issues. So that didn't change post-test. They were already seeing, had very positive attitudes towards working with this population, and we're very supportive on the population. And so I think that is also very telling that is the facility that was willing to work with us, were the ones that already had those positive attitudes in place. So I definitely think that there's some work to be done in terms of figuring out how to get into and build stronger connections and relationships with all types of facilities, not just the ones who are already openly willing and happy to receive an LGBTQ training, right? In terms of following up on training and diversity, unfortunately for this particular research project, we had not. There were plans to, but unfortunately COVID stopped sort of access to facilities and halted a lot of research in a lot of ways starting in 2020. We wanted to follow up specifically because the other piece of the pre to post test data that I sort of skimmed past was that perceived preparedness to work with this community actually decreased from pre to post test. That before they took the training, a lot of folks felt that they were really prepared to work with this population. And then by post test, as their content knowledge and understanding of issues around the LGBTQ community increased, how prepared they felt to work with this population actually decreased. And I think part of that was the more I know, the more I realized I didn't know before. I sort of had an inflated sense of preparedness. And so we actually really wanted to follow up about a year and a half later to see that, with supportive attitudes that are already in place and now a better understanding, did that perceived preparedness actually increase over time? Because the post test was done immediately post workshop. So over time, did perceived preparedness go up, and did behaviors actually change, right? Because that's the important part, that as much as education and awareness is important, what we do with that information is really what is going to impact the clients the most. So yeah, I would hope for sort of a follow-up, 6 months to a year, 18 months post workshop to see how long-term that has impacted. I don't have the data for these participants, but yeah, we would definitely love to be able to do that.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I noticed that there were a few questions curious a little bit more about sort of the facilities and approaching organizations, which you just spoke to a little bit, but I'm going to combine sort of two of the questions here.
Okay.
Where, one attendee is interested in sort of services that are specific to LGBTQ community. So how common are LGBTQ living facilities, or does it tend to be like these sort of people serving larger populations, and then more you're providing training on this on LGBTQ people in general, or are there commonly or increasingly commonly LGBTQ specific facilities? And then another question, just speaking a little bit more to the process of approaching, and whether maybe like different organizations require different approaches to how you engaged them.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a great question, and it's a great idea, and one that is starting to gain some traction. So I have heard of LGBTQ queer specific facilities that are being designed and implemented primarily in large metropolitan areas. So I've seen some offered that have popped up in Chicago, I believe, recently. I think there's a couple in LA, San Francisco area, New York City. I've seen a couple with senior living facilities that are specific to catering to the queer community. And they're incredibly cool. I haven't visited them personally myself, but they just seem like incredibly cool, affirming spaces that really highlight and celebrate those identities for folks, and create that sense of community that a lot of LGBTQ folks and LGBTQ older adults have relied on their entire lives. Those unfortunately are the exception and not the norm. Most older LGBTQ folks who are living in senior living facilities and community facilities, those are sort of what I'm going to call generic or general serving population facilities that are not specific to the LGBTQ community, which is why it is so important to get these types of trainings and workshops into those more general serving organizations. In Ohio, which is where I am, there are no senior living facilities that specifically cater to the LGBTQ community. And we counted, I think there were like 1,600 facilities across the state in Ohio, and only about 12% of them had participated in any kind of LGBTQ specific diversity training. So it really is a need that needs to be addressed, that we need to be offering, well, not offering, but we need to be figuring out how to get those educational opportunities and trainings into different facilities. And I'm not sure I have the best one. Yeah, I saw somebody put in the chat that the Human Rights Campaign, SAGE, has an ongoing project. There are online programs SAGE actually reports how many places and which places are credentialed. And again, it's less than 25% of folks, at least in the state of Ohio where we were looking.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I'm just sorting through the chat a little bit, and off of the sort of point about like the communities that are being served by the different centers. One attendee was interested in a bit about like whether the trainings that you were given were tending to facilities that served higher income elders, or if there was diversity in sort of the socioeconomic elements and what you might expect to see in terms of differences with resistant investment or other elements of the training based on that component.
Interesting. That's a great question, and one that we didn't necessarily dig into more. So I don't have data that I can provide evidence to share with you. But the community organization that we work with was a excuse me a community grounded and a community based organization. So they did offer a sliding scale. So it was not necessarily a private living facility. Folks who are on the lower income did pay less. I would think, and this is just my hypothesis, that folks who are more affluent have more options. And so they have more opportunities to seek out more supportive environments that they can be more, there's a lot of power in having resources to make choices, right? And so LGBTQ older adults who are facing more financial hardships might not have the same flexibility to shop around and look for a facility that feels more supportive and more affirming for them. They would have to transition into housing that they can afford to live in. And so again, that sort of underscores the importance of getting trainings out there for all diverse facilities, so that no matter where folks end up, whether they have the opportunities and the resources to make those choices or not, those facilities are prepared to create supportive environments to affirm them and who they are and their health and well-being while they're there. It's a great question, though. Thank you.
Thank you. And forgive me for going a little quickly, but I want to make sure we get to as many questions as we can before the end. A few questions came in relating to, you discussed some of the data about efficacy, but people were curious if there were any other insights you were interested in sharing about what were emerging from your data, and also if you have any outcomes or metric data from facility residents, or if there's any information like planned to be collected in that area.
Yeah, so we, for the data that I showed, the paper that was published, we looked at content knowledge, which increased from pre-workshop to post-workshop. We looked at supportive attitudes, which did not change, which I said were sort of skewed towards the higher end pre-workshop. And so we were glad to see that had not changed or decreased post-workshop. And then we looked at perceived preparedness. And again, that was sort of the finding that decreased post-workshop. Which was really interesting to think about how folks feel less prepared the more that they know. For this particular study, we did not collect data from residents in particular, and part of that was to protect, anonymity of folks who were living in that particular facility. We were only interested in working with the staff, assessing staff attitudes, staff beliefs, staff understanding, and where they were at, and the impact that this could have on the way that they were creating those environments and supportive environments for their clients. We didn't actually go in and assess how the clients perceive the environment and whether or not they perceived a shift pre and post workshop. Again, I think that could have been a really interesting follow-up part to this study, to collect data to see again, if those behaviors actually changed and if we saw real implementation of the conversations that we've had in the longer term. And so hopefully future iterations of running this workshop and working with different communities, we'll be able to do that follow-up to see if those changes actually happen in the day-to-day functioning of the organization then.
Thank you. I'm gonna try to fit in one or two more real quick. One in the chat asks, what might be ways that you recommend of reducing isolation that older LGBTQ adults might experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, I mean, I would say I really like the idea of LGBTQ older adult facilities. I think for a lot of LGBTQ folks, having that sense of community and that sense of connection with people who have shared identities have supported folks, that idea of chosen family, right? Have supported folks across their lifetime. And so I love the idea of having that. I also wonder if that can be built and supported in, again, those more sort of general serving senior living facilities as well, right? We see a lot of evidence to show that GSAs and LGBTQ organizations are really important in schools for adolescents and youth, having that space to meet folks with shared identities and make connections with others who have shared experiences and things like that. I wonder if that would translate as well to senior living facilities. There's a lot of importance that is placed on social activities and social engagement in senior living facilities, having different talking circles and knitting groups and things like that that go on in those organizations. And I wonder if having an LGBTQ social club for individuals who identify as part of that community or who have family members that identify as part of that community might be a really cool way for folks to make those social connections. I haven't seen any research, anybody who's doing that anywhere, or any research to show that that would be effective, but that would be a really cool project too.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. And as we come to the end of our time, someone asks, are you giving or could you give virtual trainings across the country in this area?
Yeah, that's a great idea. There are some, we are not personally, there are some ongoing virtual trainings that do exist through SAGE and the Human Rights Campaign. So there are some that are available. One of the reasons we specifically did a face-to-face training is because those webinar and online trainings have existed for quite some time, and folks were not engaging with them. And so one of the reasons specifically we wanted to go in and do this face-to-face training and work with community organizations on the ground was to actually figure out why they weren't engaging with these online trainings that were existed, what were the barriers that were making it difficult for that. And again, that's a story for a whole other day, but yeah, they do exist, and folks aren't necessarily engaging with them as much as we would hope they are.
Got it. Well, thank you so much
Yeah,
for your time today, Dr. Olson, and for giving such thoughtful answers to all the questions. Thank you to everyone who came to our webinar today and who engaged in this really important conversation and provided such thoughtful questions upon which to have a engaging Q&A. So really appreciate everyone's time and thank you again for joining us today. Now it's a minute after the hour, so I think we'll close out the webinar there. But yeah, thank you and take care.
great. Thank you.